Good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are you doing? Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome if you are listening live 8:30 in the morning here in the UK, and welcome also if you are joining us on the replay. I have with me the amazing Imogene Denton, who is the Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Birmingham City University. And you'll have to bear with us this morning. We're having a few tech trouble, so Imogene is actually listening to me through a phone, right? And so to avoid a lot of echo, there might be a slight sort of lag in the conversation. But Imogene, welcome. Good morning.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to this conversation.
This is going to be a good one. So in our prep talk, we kind of talked about, would anything be off topic and all of that? Because so here's the thing for those that maybe aren't aware. So we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or in Imogene's world, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as it's called, the other way around. I do think we have Elon Musk to thank for making DEI more popular in terms of people knowing what DEI stands for. But in higher education, so Imogene works in higher education, and a quick disclaimer as well, obviously the views expressed here today are the views of Imogene's and not necessarily Birmingham City University, who Imogene works for. So we arranged this date last year, and then, unfortunately, obviously things that happened at the start of this year made this conversation almost all the more relevant. And obviously, we had the resignation of Harvard President Claudine Gay, and then we had the very unfortunate passing, obviously, of Antoinette Bonney, Candia Bailey. And that's kind of where we wanted to start the conversation. Before we dive into that, one of the things that we are going to talk about is some of the differences between the US and the UK in terms of higher education. So for those that don't know, last year on June the 29th, the Supreme Court of America voted 6-3 in favor of eliminating the race-conscious affirmative action in terms of the admission policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And it was actually based on action that was brought by a body called the Students for Fair Admissions, which is a group of primarily Asian American students. So just to kind of put some context to where the American debate has gone. And if you're listening to this live, in the comments, you will see also I have dropped a link to a YouTube video if you want to delve into that a little bit more. So claims around, standards and maintaining standards and what affirmative action and race and all of that does around this debate. You can go and delve into that, which we will potentially touch on it in this conversation. So let's start with, and Imogene, when we were prepping this week, I said, how much do we want to talk about this? And I think you rightly said, Imogene, we can't have this conversation and not talk about what happened with Claudine Gay and Bonnie Candia Bailey. So, I guess my first question is almost like, what are some of the challenges and learnings that come out of that story? And, how do we create more inclusive and psychologically safe spaces in higher education when it comes to the workplace?
I mean, it's a tricky one, Cheryl. So, first of all, side in this conversation, because for those who don't know, Dr. Bailey did commit suicide. She was a senior vice president for student affairs at an American university. And I think, for me, it's not necessarily just about HE on this one, Cheryl. I think when you are a senior, I'm even going to say a senior woman, I think the challenges are very difficult. I think that the challenge is made even more so when you're a senior black woman operating, I think, in most workspaces. But yes, I think this applies definitely to higher education as well. But in terms of the learnings, I think what's been interesting is that there have been comments coming through saying things like, affirmative action has gone too far, or that people have standards been lowered, was the conversation that we've had. And I guess before I say what the learnings are, I just wanted to. I had a conversation with another member of our Black Talent Awards family, and that person said to me, when people talk about standards being lowered, people never really mention that we had President Trump, leading the USA. We had Boris Johnson, leading the UK. And I'm not showing any of my political colours here, but we don't often hear about standards being lowered until we start to talk about black people in senior roles. And I would say that for those who believe that we work in a meritocracy, I don't want to disappoint people, but it's not always the case. People forever have been put in positions because of who they know as opposed to what they know and who they're connected to. But I think it's obviously more visible if we have senior people of colour. We are more visible in spaces because we don't often occupy those spaces. But I guess for me, and I'm not doubting their credibility in terms of Dr. Bailey and Dr. Gay, because often I think that when we're in these spaces, we overperform as opposed to underperforming. So I think that a lot of this is really about a witch hunt. So, the rights or wrongs of whatever, people say. So I think in Dr. Gay's case, she didn't condemn something that was perceived as anti-Semitic, but she did follow up with a sort of, it depends on context, is what I think she'd said, but she said that any sort of genocide was wrong. And, I can't quote exactly what she had said, but then after that, when people said that she wasn't being anti-Semitic, they then looked at plagiarism and they went right back into some of the papers that she'd written and said that she had plagiarized. And so for me, this is really about how do we make sure that we're checking in with people who are in these senior positions, making sure that they have communities that they can lean into. I think the higher up you go, as I read in one article, they said something around the altitude gets thinner the higher up you go. So in terms of breathing space and oxygen, people are less forgiving than perhaps they would be if you were male, if you were white. So I think that the learning is that actually it's not that we have positive action here as opposed to affirmative action, because we know that we are not operating in a level playing field. And I think that particularly in the case of Dr. Bailey, who had cried out and said that, she was stressed, she felt she was being bullied, felt she was being harassed, we have to look at ourselves as organisations and say, what are we really putting in place to support people, especially when they're in senior roles and they're quite isolated. And we have to believe people and listen to people and make sure that we are there for them and that we, we recognise and we tell the truth in terms of what's happening in spaces. Because I think often there is perception and there's reality, and people might perceive that people are getting some sort of advantage that they're not deserving of. But I think sometimes we have to talk about the reality of the situation, as in, this is what the true picture looks like. This is how we have, done this in terms of addressing some of these inequalities, and this is why we need to be, if you like, talking more about social justice as well as EDI, because we often talk about EDI but not social justice.
Yeah, there's a lot of points there to unpack. I did have a question, Imogeen, actually, about whether you think it's actually worse in higher education. I totally agree with you that this is an issue across all workplaces, in terms of, the psychological safety and some of the challenges. There have been lots of studies done around the challenges for women, especially where women intersect with. I mean, there are challenges. Intersectionality is so important anyway across all genders, right? But there obviously have been a lot of studies around. You know, if we think about, for example, the gender pay gap, and then when you overlay ethnicity on the gender pay gap, we know that um, black women, and that has to be separated out as well. It's not just by color. You know, when you look at African versus Caribbean, it's different. But also we've got, for example, women from a Bangladeshi heritage as well, sort of like being lower. So we know that there is something about, women of color, and the challenges that they have as they sort of like ascend through the organization, right? Generally, there's lots of research on it. I've got a question about whether you think it's potentially worse in higher education, or is it the same? And if it is worse, why or why not? I'm just curious about that particular point.
So I think that higher education has its different set of challenges. And I can't necessarily speak about other industries so to say whether it's better or worse. But what I would say is, in higher education, a lot of the times organisations are run by academics, and I think in order for people from a career perspective, in order to reach those sorts of heights of professor, that kind of senior role, there are steps and things that you would have to do that I think put more of a challenge on you. So, for example, if you look at like the kind of progression route, often people will have, they've done research activity, they've been cited in different journals, they're asked for references from, sort of, if you're not quite a professor yet, you would have to, when you're going for promotion, you would need references from professors to kind of people who recognise and can say in your field that, yeah, this is great work. But if you were to look at the numbers of people who are professors, if there are, and these are rough guesstimates, if there are over 20,000 professors in the UK, then only around maybe 7,000 or 8,000 of those are women. And then if you start to break that down in terms of ethnicity, you would have maybe a couple hundred who would be people of colour. And then if you were to break that down again and say, well, how many are black, how many are Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Indian, then the numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller. So in terms of people saying and citing your work, I think it's more challenging for people of colour because they may not have the sorts of networks, and have those kind of groups who recognise and talk about their work. So in terms of higher education, I feel it's quite unique in that way. And so then you will see that even though we have more females, people who identify as women studying at university, as you go through the ranks, you then find that professors are predominantly male. So there is a kind of, because of history and how institutions were created and developed, how universities came about, there is this real, if you like, mountain to climb in terms of, if you're a woman trying to be a professor and then go into leading a higher education or an academic institution, and then it gets harder and harder the more you, as you say, you put on those characteristics and go, well, what's really happening here?
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely does. And thank you, those of you that are putting comments, and I can't see all of their usernames, but Marsha, Dixon Terry, who has thank you for adding your. I always love facts. It's the accountant in me. Currently, 66 Black women professors. So there we are in terms of the stats. Out of however many, several thousands of professors there are in the UK. And I think the point that you're making there, Imogeen, it actually, I think, sort of almost like segues nicely into the learnings, because I think the point is, in academia, it's I guess one of the aspects of it that is quite unique is, I think, to summarize what you're saying, is in order to climb up to become, a professor, a vice chancellor, whatever it might be, you have to have been cited and endorsed by your peers. And that is going to be harder if you're not part of the in group. We know this stuff from the world of DE&I. If you're not part of the in group, that's harder to achieve anyway. So actually, there's this unfortunately this kind of vicious cycle, because you can't get the endorsements, you can't get, and then when you do get to the top, you're then, hence the witch hunt. So I think just the way that you've explained it there makes a lot more sense, in terms of, I think people, when they now look at, the Claudine Gays of the world or other people, you can understand the challenges of getting there, and what happens when somebody gets to the top and maybe they weren't the person that you back, and that was kind of the Claudine Gay situation. It's like somebody's at the top. I didn't back them. I didn't endorse them. How did they get there? What can we do to get them out? That's kind of where it ends up.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to do with the nature of the institution. I mean, Harvard is seen as, one of the leading institutions in the world. And so there will always be that sort of right wing, how can this possibly happen? How can we let this happen? So there will be people who would have, I think, been looking to try and remove her. You can see, for any sort of reason. So going back and looking into, papers that she'd written a long, long time ago, and it wasn't necessarily plagiarism. I think it may have been down to the fact that she hadn't quite referenced them in precisely the way they needed to have been referenced, which is why I go back to the comment about the altitude thinner when you get to the top. People are less forgiving. There isn't the space. Well, I say less forgiving. They're less forgiving of some more than others. And so when Marsha puts the comment in that actually there are only 66, I think, did you say black women professors?
Yeah, black women.
I think those women have to be supported and encouraged because of the challenge and the battle they would have faced in order to even get there. And on top of that, what I will say is, some of you may or may not be aware that we have something called awarding gaps in a lot of universities. And the awarding gap is really looking at the outcome of degrees. So looking at who gets the good degrees in terms of 2, 1s and firsts. And the awarding gap is more often linked with ethnicity. So we know that even when you look at factors in terms of what qualifications people had when they went into universities, where they lived in terms of neighbourhoods, etc., one of the strongest determinants in terms of what degree outcome you'll get is ethnicity. And so we have to really understand and unpick what's happening there. Is it all about racism? Probably not. Is some of it about racism? Probably. So if you're already less likely to get a good degree, then the chances of you then being able to go on and do a postgraduate research degree are less, because you have to have, like a 2, 1 or a first in order to go down that route. So already you can appreciate what many of these women have achieved in terms of getting to be leaders in higher education institutions.
It's fascinating, and we're going to delve into that. But you're right in terms of the connection between the awarding gap and then almost then that pipeline actually up into sort of like professorships. I don't know if that's what you call them, but that the pipeline is going to be narrower because of the awarding gap. I wanted to just sort of close off on this thing about, because Marsha raised it as well, about sponsorship, and we talk about, so some of the lessons learned around the support that, that women, particularly women of colour, need in those spaces and what that looks like. Have you got any thoughts specifically? And then I am going to come into this point around the boys in higher ed as well. I'm going to come onto that one. I'm just going to hide that. But yeah, have you got any? If we just sort of close off the point around, the psychological safety aspect in the workplace, what are your sort of like takeaways, and what sort of things can higher ed institutions and other workplaces be putting in place around psychological safety and well-being?
So you touched on sponsorship, and definitely, I do think that people need sponsors. We need people who are going to speak up for us in spaces when we're not there. I think it's really important that, people are given opportunities to get in, because sometimes it's about people getting a tap on the shoulder and going, oh, I see there's a job going over there. I think you'd be really good. I think you should really consider applying for that. And I think when you get those thoughts of, it gives you courage to kind of put yourself forward and go, oh, me, really? Yeah, okay, I will do. And when you're not in the room, people speaking up and going, well, actually, I think this person's really, really good. They've shown that they're capable, able, whatever. Let's talk about giving this person opportunities. Because that happens all the time in terms of looking at who gets to be on various projects and who doesn't. But I also think in terms of having that kind of psychological safety, from a personal level, I've always had a mentor, but I've had mentors who don't, I've had a range of mentors, but often they're not part of the organisation that I work for, because I think it's really important to sometimes hear the views of people who have absolutely nothing to gain by you making a decision one way or another, but can give you a completely different perspective. And I have a mentor who is completely the opposite to me, white, male, scientist background, senior leader, Russell Group University, and at first I kind of thought, I have nothing in common with this person, I don't know how this is going to work. But actually hearing somebody else's perspective on things, I think has really helped me in terms of navigating my own career and how I operate in various spaces. But I do think that we should regularly check in on people. Just say hi, just, ask people how they're doing. There's some of the things, and I'm conscious of time, but these are some of a few things that people can do that I think will create that kind of safety net and support that you need.
I agree. And to add on to what you said about the sponsorship, a bit like you, when earlier on in my career, my mentors were mainly male, not the same ethnicity as me at all. And I did a talk, about a year ago to a group of young women, and I was talking to them about the importance of having, a mentor, but particularly a sponsor, right, as well in your organization. Ideally, I always talk about this, having a sponsor in your organization, having people that will talk up for you when you're not in the room, critical, right? I always talk about this. And I remember I gave this talk, and this young woman, a young black woman, came up to me afterwards, and she said, oh, I love the advice, etc., but I don't know how I'm going to find a mentor or a sponsor because there's nobody here that looks like me. And I was like, who said they've got to look like you? Because if you're going to be waiting around to find somebody that looks like you in the top to help pull you up, you're going to be waiting around for a long time. Right? You have to take the mentorship and the sponsorship wherever you can get it from. And I like what you said about organization. So, there is something about taking ownership for your own career and your progression. But I think also organizations now recognizing the challenges to individuals from different backgrounds with different intersectionalities. And I definitely want to get onto the thing about boys that somebody said, because, we are talking about women because of the Claudine Gay, Antoinette, Candia Bailey, but obviously, men at the intersections in particular, so men, who are LGBTQ plus, men of color, men with disabilities, etc. They are also facing challenges. We haven't yet gotten to the boys in higher education, which if we've got time, we'll touch on to it. Not that we haven't got somewhere to be, but we'll touch on to that if we can. So hopefully that's kind of covered up. I just wanted to pick up on Simon's point as well, because I think it just talks as unconscious biases always seeps through when you have a black or brown person in charge, especially women. I saw this yesterday on an interview panel I sat on for principal for a large secondary academy. An amazing black female applicant, 110% right for the job, because obviously you've also got to be overqualified, right? And the conversation about her assertiveness was seeped in unconscious bias and racism. I called it out immediately, and it was denied immediately. Frustrating. However, it did bring a full stop to that narrative. We are a panel of women as well. unconscious biases, which obviously we all have, and those biases show up differently, and they show up differently depending on the identity. So for women, I think we talked about this, for women from, for example, an Asian background, East Asian or South Asian, there might be a view actually that those women should be more quiet or more submissive. So sometimes when they do speak up, they can also be like almost like a double bind, because of the expectations. Although I would say things are kind of changing generally, so it's a little bit up and down. But depending on people's frame of reference, there can be these stereotypes that are overlaid on the gender as well. Go on, Imogeen.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, because I think there are a whole range of different sorts of unconscious bias, and sometimes when we talk about unconscious bias, there is this kind of general attitude that, well, everyone's got unconscious bias, so it's all right, we're all biased. But we don't necessarily always see the impact that it has, and we don't always call out the different types. So, some of it can be around, having that affinity, with certain people, so you have this instant connection, and automatically you're kind of like more positive towards those people. But then you also got the kind of in-group, out-group. Sometimes there are groups of people who, kind of do the same sorts of activity as you, and so you kind of feel you've got more to talk about. So again, you kind of go to the in-group, out-group. And then, as you know, there are always those kinds of, those in the instant, you see people, you see their skin color, you see whether they have a disability, a physical disability or not. You can look at their age. So there are all these different swift judgments that we make. And then we then kind of start to say, well, that person won't be able to do that, obviously, or they can't do this, or they can do that. And we put our own judgments because of what we think somebody is capable of. And it does seep in so many different places and spaces.
Yeah.
And how we address it is definitely being able to call it out and look for it in our systems and processes.
Yeah, and bias can be, a bit like you're saying, bias just because it's there, it's not we just have to accept it and live with it. We can rewire to sort of like, first of all, reduce the impact of the bias, but also to surface it. So one of the things I often talk about is in interviewing. So to Saima, in your situation, what I would have said almost, a good thing that interview panels can do before they go in, there's almost like a set of questions that you can ask yourself to sort of prime yourself to be prepared that your biases might show up, right? So you might say things like, okay, does this person's CV remind me of anybody? Is that a good feeling? Is it a negative feeling? What am I, and you ask those questions. It's called priming. So you ask yourself those questions before you go into the interview. And science says that it just raises our awareness of those unconscious biases. And so our slow thinking starts to take over and starts to counteract some of those snap judgments. So that's just one of the ways, certainly for panels, probably easier actually if you do it before. So as a panel, you have that discussion beforehand, right? This person's coming in, what sort of biases might show up? So rather than having the awkward calling out, I mean, you can do the calling out afterwards as well, fair play to you. But you can also do it before as well. We're going to go on really quickly. We started talking about equity and equality of admissions. And I want to link back to this point around the boys. So interesting, the stat that I gave around the affirmative action and what's going on in the US about, affirmative action coming to an end for Harvard and North Carolina, that action was being brought by primarily Asian students who felt that they were being disadvantaged, right? If that makes sense, because if you think of a system where basically, and I've been listening to quite a lot of debate about this, but a system where, if, for example, an African American student would, submit their application, their grades are a little bit lower, they then submit an explanation as to, the struggles that they've had, etc., and they're given a boost, their grades are given a boost. And the Asian American students were saying, well, that's not happening to us. And actually, my grades are incredible and I can't now get in. Do you know what I mean? And that's some of the debate around, whether affirmative action is fair, you know, whether there is this lowering of standards. And I do wonder whether does that sort of policy fuel the biases that then when somebody like a Claudine Gay gets to the top, there is almost this assumption, oh, they're not there on merit because we've got these systems that sort of lower the standard. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying the two are related, but we almost shoot ourselves in the foot. It almost feels like a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Or it's not transparent. You know, the processes aren't transparent enough such that those accusations can be dealt with.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of there can be a perception that things are unfair and that it's impacting on this community or that community. I think one of the things that we're not great at doing is being transparent. So setting out, okay, this is the current situation. These are the issues that we're facing, and this is how we're addressing it. So people don't always see what's behind some of the, if you like, positive action. And at the same time, I think that I think there are myths that everyone's there on merit. I think that we have to face the reality that people get into various places because they might have gone to X private school. I think they call them public schools in America. And so these schools, they are almost guaranteed places because they happen to have gone to this particular place. So I think we have to be more transparent about how people get to where they are, and that it isn't always about merit. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is about the connections. It's about the connections that people have. It's about going to the right tennis club or knowing the right people. And I'm sure there was some high-profile cases in the media where some American actors had sort of done something behind the scenes to ensure that their children and the children of their friends could access some particular university. So I think it's about busting the myth that somebody is taking your place because you got a high grade than they did. I think it is about leveling the playing field and understanding how everybody got there, and that not everybody got there for the reason you think they got there, and actually doing something that is going to address that inequality. So I think a lot of it is about rumour and, oh, so-and-so got there and I heard this and that. But I think we have to be transparent about our data. I think we have to be more, if you like, forensic about our admission policy. So anything in terms of our policies and procedures, we need to look at them and look at whether they are, you know, go back to, people don't like the phrase equality impact assessments, but I do think we have to look at our processes and procedures to look at who is disadvantaged by them, and then we need to, if necessary, mitigate that disadvantage. But a lot of us don't really look at all of our procedures systematically to look at who has an unfair advantage, who's disadvantaged, how do we mitigate that?
Yeah. And let's just go to the data, because I want to bring in this point around the boys, and I can't see the username in the platform that I'm on, so apologies. But I want to go back to, first of all, how would we explain that there are now 13% fewer boys in higher education in the UK? Are universities treating this as an inequality as much as the lack of access to education for girls in other countries? I'll let Imogeen come back on that. Having read and being a big advocate of the book Of Boys and Men, my understanding is that it's probably not treated as seriously as, for example, lack of access to education for girls. But I'll leave Imogeen to comment on that shortly. And then also, society is generally aware of the negative biases against women. Do you feel the negative biases against men are well documented too and treated in the same ways as the ones our young innocent boys are facing? My short answer would be no, but that's having, you know, as I say, having read the book Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which I'd strongly encourage everyone to read. You know, he talks very much there about the data that, you know, if you were to go back 20 years ago or something, you know, men far outnumbered women in terms of the graduates coming out, and now it's completely flipped. You know, it's way more women coming out of university with degrees, and I know this because my daughter who graduated a few years ago, is always complaining about the dating pool, right? So I know that there is a disparity between, the kind of the sort of the men coming out, and it links to, you said something about data, and I like, I like the fact that the stats were quoted about the 13% less, because one of the arguments against affirmative action, and I think when we get into the equity and equality, and you look at, for example, those Asian American students that were kind of saying, look, this isn't fair, because, for example, an Asian American student coming from a very disadvantaged background, then not being able to get a place because of somebody, just because of their ethnicity. So I think there is an interesting question, which is where ethnicity sits, almost like in the hierarchy of, positive action, if we look at it like that, in terms of initiatives to, kind of get students in and all of that. And you talked about the awarding gap, and actually from, like, say, for example, an admissions perspective, and then support to, students to come through the ranks to even get into universities, should we be looking at other characteristics like socioeconomic status and all of those sorts of things? Does that potentially make it fairer? Because there is a challenge that sometimes things like affirmative action, and the US have got this challenge, it sometimes benefits, for example, middle class Black people. Right? Do you know what I mean? And there's something about, how do we delve into the data to make sure, as you say, that the most disadvantaged, young people are, kind of given the access to the opportunity? So do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. Socioeconomic circumstances is a very important factor. And it is actually a factor that I think a lot of universities do look at. So I know I mentioned things like the awarding gap, but we also look at gaps between people who come from the most deprived neighbourhoods and those who come from the least deprived neighbourhoods. So, it is definitely a factor. And yes, in terms of looking at the underrepresentation of boys, particularly white boys, I guess, in universities, it is something that we look at through things like, in the UK, through our widening participation programs. So there's a lot of work that goes on in terms of going into schools and kind of supporting schools and creating a pathway into universities, doing taster days, sessions, and all sorts of things. And no, I can't explain why the numbers of young men going into universities is lowering. What I will say is that if you look at some of the courses and some of the industries that people go into, so for instance, if you have a university that does a lot of, if you like, nursing courses, midwifery courses, etc., we will often find that those careers are often gendered, so you get more women going into those careers. So those universities that offer those courses will have more women on those courses, etc. And then if you look at those, universities that do more things like engineering, architecture, etc., you often find that those courses seem to have a lot more male students on those courses. And so some of it is about what is put on offer and who goes into those careers, and how we educate people and let people know the benefits of going into various careers. So there is some of that going on. What I'd also say is, though, in complicating that picture, when you then still look at, even though we've said, yes, more women go into universities, etc., when you look at the leadership, the management, it's still more men are there as managers, are there as the people who are influencing policies. I do think we do have to do more to reach out and work with young men. I think that what you'll find is a lot of people will look at universities and go, I'm hearing lots in the media, people leave university and they go into a huge debt, and I don't want that sort of thing for me in terms of starting out in life. And so people will then go into trades. So you'll find that a lot of young men will go into being an electrician, being a plumber, being, some of these sort of vocational careers, where you'll find that far less women go into those. So there's something about when you look at society and you go, okay, where are all these young men who are missing from universities going? And you can see that they're going into industry, and women seem to go into the kind of service careers. So I think it's about looking at the entire, if you like, mix of what's happening and how we open up career paths to people from all different backgrounds.
Yeah.
So, because you have to look at, well, if they're not going there, where else are they going?
Yeah.
And if they are in that space, then why aren't there other women in that space?
Yeah.
So, some of it is self-selection, is what I'd say. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, and I'm going to link to this comment here about marketing campaigns being female biased, and I think I would say certainly in terms of STEM, so there's been a lot of work to get women and girls into STEM. Obviously, I mean generally, and this is part of the reason that we're slightly going down a rabbit hole, which we're going to come back out of shortly. But this is part of the reason that Richard Reeves has done this work around of boys and men, because there has been a lot of work over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years to open women's minds to, different roles that typically were seen as men's roles, right? There's been a lot of work in that place. So hence, there have been a lot of marketing campaigns to get women into STEM. Look at Barbie, the different Barbie dolls that came out, right? Barbie could do anything. Barbie the doctor, Barbie the scientist, Barbie the engineer, Barbie the everything. But you've had less equivalent for boys is part of the issue. And I think, there's a comment here, quotas to attract girls in STEM or finance. Are there any, and obviously I'm a finance person, are there any quotas to attract boys in psychology, HR? I know certainly within the NHS, this is something they've talked about, how do we attract more men into nursing, mental health care, et cetera, all of those sorts of things. So I think definitely there is work to do around diversity in terms of gender. And I'm really pleased to see a lot more men. I'm just going to show this. A lot more men, certainly even on here, working in this space of how do we open the minds and maybe allow young boys in particular to see that particular careers or paths aren't as gendered as they thought they were. Because I think certainly that's what's happened for young girls. Young girls' minds have been open to a world of possibilities in a way that young boys haven't been. It's still relatively gendered, would be my perspective. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Imogeen. And then we're going to go on very finally for the last few minutes to freedom of speech. just to finally finish us both off.
So has there been as much work? So I can't deny there has been a lot of work in terms of getting women to consider various careers, etc. There's been a lot. But I guess, it's in terms of looking at the history, in terms of where we're coming from, historically, women did tend to either stay at home or were in some of the lower paid jobs. So yes, there was a real push in terms of getting women into, better job roles. Do we need to do the same for boys? Probably we do. We probably do at some level, but we also, as I say, have to also look at industries and do the same in terms of for those industries that are dominated, because STEM subjects are still predominantly boys on those subjects. I saw a comment flash up about the way that assessments are done, and it's gone again, but somebody makes a really good point in terms of the way boys learn, the way girls learn, and I do think that we do need to offer a range of assessments so that people can do their best and show themselves in, whatever the best light that is. So people do learn in different ways, so we should, I guess, widen the way that assessments are done. I'm sorry, I'm probably not answering your question, but just to say, I would say we need to look at things in the round. So where we have underrepresentation generally, whether that be boys, girls, ethnicity, disability, I do think we have to address it because it is unfair.
Yeah.
So that would be my, let's look at it, but let's look at the whole picture, because when you look at little segments of it, you can
Yeah.
say, okay, these courses, HR, that looks really, really, gendered, but we also then need to look at engineering.
Yeah.
So we have to take that balanced approach, and yes,
Yeah.
we should be championing equality for all, not just equality
Yeah.
for some and not others.
Absolutely. And the final comment on this one that I'll take is just it's an interesting perspective, I guess. I think boys don't go to universities because of marketing campaigns and also the pressure from patriarchy on boys to earn money quickly, but also feminism, I think. I mean, and that's a whole other rabbit hole. But I think there is something. I mean, even within the manosphere, if we call it that, there is pressure on boys and men to even you look at your Jordan Petersons of the world, and you don't feel free to not comment on Jordan Peterson, Imogene, but I will for you. Even the Jordan Petersons of the world are still pushing this narrative of men being men and sort of doing that stuff, which doesn't necessarily help. Again, I think it sort of links in with that point around the pressure that boys feel to still it's that typical, it's the provider role, right? The provider protector role that is still out there, which is attached to that traditional sort of like patriarchal view. But well said, Imogene. Really, bravo. Imogene knows the stuff.
Thank you. I just wanted to come on that last point in terms of, yes, I do think that there are these kind of pressures, but I think there are also pressures on women to have it all. You must, you can have a career, you can have kids, you should balance this, you should be this, you should look fantastic, you should give birth and get straight back to work and go to the top. And I'm not saying that people can't have it all. I just think that there are unnecessary pressures on all genders. And obviously, we haven't even touched on people who are non-binary and the issues and the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
I don't know that we can cover all of these topics in one session.
No.
It's a lot, and there's a lot of pressure for lots of
Yeah.
people.
And unfortunately, I don't think we're even going to have time to do freedom of speech justice. But the reason that it was kind of like on the wish list of things to talk to is because, there is this thing about, I think I put in my post this morning, higher education institutions are, I think somebody calls them, the seat of learning and discovery. There is something about their place in society. They have a very, very special place in society. I mean, all of academia does, right? But universities in particular, they are the seat of learning and discovery. They're where, groundbreaking research is coming out of, really special places. And there is a real dichotomy and a real dilemma at the moment about freedom of speech and whether that should or shouldn't be curtailed, which is almost a full circle, actually, right back to Claudine Gay almost, and where we started around the parameters that need to be put around freedom of speech. So I don't know whether you do want to comment on that, Imogene, just in terms of the kinds of challenges around that topic, and the sorts of things that universities are doing to sort of navigate that space, and then we'll bring it to a close.
So yes, I mean, I think freedom of speech is really important for universities because, as you say, like that centre of knowledge creation. A debate is really encouraged at universities. We should be giving people lots of different perspectives on things. I think it's not necessarily what somebody says. Well, some of it is what people say, but often it's how it's said and where it's said and in what space. So I do think, and these are obviously everything today I've said is about my views, they're not necessarily the views of the institution I work for. I do think that we need to, if you like, we need to be able to, we need to recognise academic freedom. I do think that we actually need to educate people as to what that actually means and what that looks like and when and where it's appropriate that you share your views. Because how you do something is as important as what you say and do. And I think that there is, so often, there is a pressure. We do have a pressure to kind of suppress the views of some people. I think that what we need to be looking at is, well, how do we create the space so that people can express their views, but do it in a respectful way, and also make sure that within that space there are alternative views, so people aren't all given just this is the one view, it's the only view, and you must, this is the way, this is the truth. But I also think that people can sometimes express their views in ways that are inappropriate. So actually, people need to be educated as in this is the space and how you express those sorts of views. But it's not great to just, I don't know, scroll graffiti expressing your views, let's say, on the wall somewhere, that spread hatred about some group. That's not appropriate. But if you do want to, write a paper, get involved in a debate, or we don't deter speak. Since I've been at my institution, I don't know any speaker that's been, if you like, no platformed. I think it's about making sure there is the balance. So it is really important. It really is. It really is important. But it's about how we do it.
Yeah, I love that, because it is something that obviously it comes up a lot in academic spaces, but it does come up in workplaces as well. You have individuals that say, well, my freedom of speech, my freedom of thought needs to be protected, and they're right to an extent. I'm going to drop in. I always say I'm going to drop references in, and I always forget, but I'm going to drop in a reference to. I was telling Imogeen about this earlier in the week. There is a Reith lecture, the BBC Reith lectures by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, that I'm going to drop in around freedom of speech, which I would say is very interesting to listen to if you've got very strong views about closing down certain thoughts and how you put the parameters around it. Because Chimamanda, which probably links to obviously her being a writer, again, there's something about a writer being able to freely express, and she really talks about, from her perspective, the importance of freedom of speech. And actually, even when somebody maybe says something that's completely heinous, how do you deal with that? And how are you able to turn that into a moment of learning, if that makes sense, rather than just closing it down, or, as you say, Imogene, no platforming? And then the other link that I'm going to drop in is it's a story of a guy called Derek Black. I don't know whether you've come across this one, Imogene. He went to, probably going to get it wrong if I tried to say the university. I'm going to say the University of Florida, but that could be wrong. But it's a really fascinating story. He was a white supremacist that landed on the campus of quite a small university, which kind of meant people just really mixed and integrated. You didn't really have silos of groups. And he became quite good friends with an Orthodox Jew on campus, which obviously white supremacists generally aren't friends with Orthodox Jews. He became friends. He then got outed as being a white supremacist. But this Orthodox Jew, Matthew Stevenson, continued to befriend him, would invite him to Friday night Shabbat dinners, and he eventually sort of like came around. But it's a really good story in allyship and how you can work through and work with individuals that have very different perspectives, and how you create spaces to have the conversation. So I'll share again maybe a couple of his videos, because I think people might find it quite useful. And that's kind of it. We're going to wrap up. I'm going to let me share this final comment. It's also important to teach people how to create safe spaces, regardless of protected characteristics, but also acknowledge that not everyone may initially feel it is a safe space to share, and it would come with time. There shouldn't be an expectation for people to share immediately. A few people have said to me previously they aren't sure what to say and how to say it, and I tell them to go in with that approach, as it shows their vulnerability and that they may get something wrong. But it's been cut off. I'd have to go into LinkedIn because it's quite a long comment. But thank you for that. I think we get the gist of what you're saying. There is something about, the intent and how we show up, and the spirit. I always talk about grace in these spaces. There's something about grace, going into these conversations, giving yourself grace, but also giving the other people grace as well that you're interacting with. Final thoughts from you, Imogene?
I think this is my final thoughts are that this is a space where we're all learning. I think it's about us all learning and being willing to see things from another perspective. Is all I can say. I think we're on a learning curve, and I would say let's champion equality for all. as opposed to the group that we most, if you like, are aligned with, and then I think things will be a lot fairer.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, well said. So that's it. That's a wrap because we've gone for like nearly double what we usually do. But there was so much in the comments, and it was just and we could have gone on for another hour. So thank you everyone that was listening. Honestly, thank you so much for your time. It's been incredible to sort of like share this space with you. Thank you so much for listening, and if you're listening on the replay, please do feel free to reach out to Imogene. Actually, myself and Imogene are talking next week at an expo called Ahead by Bets, a higher education expo. I think Imogene is on a panel on the 26th of January about ED&I in higher education. And I am speaking on the Thursday. I'll be doing a keynote on connectivity, so talking about hybrid versus online, etc., just based on my experiences of training, etc. So thank you all so much for joining us. Honestly, it's been I feel really privileged that you've decided to spend a little bit of time listening to us this morning, and I hope you found it really useful. Thank you, Imogene. I forgot to say as well, one of our Black Talent Award judges, obviously part of the BTA's family. Thank you, Imogene.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful, Cheryl. Do invite me
Amazing.
back.
I will do. Thank you. And that's it. Have a great Friday and a good weekend, everyone. Ciao.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.